Tilman Ruff is the co-president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which was the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985, and is a co-founder and founding chair of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and for its groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such weapons. Tilman is Associate Professor in the Nossal Institute for Global Health, the University of Melbourne, and serves on the World Health Organization's Western Pacific Hepatitis B Expert Resources Panel. So please join me in welcoming Tilman Ruff.
Thanks very much, Bridget. Can you hear me? Yeah? It's an honour to be here. I'm grateful to you all for coming. So in this difficult topic, there's a few things that really help sort of guide one. And for me, some of the prophetic wisdom of Albert Einstein really is a recurring source of strength and guidance. His statement that those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act, which I think probably guides most of us here. But also his very early recognition that the harnessing of the power of the atom, essentially the fundamental power that drives the universe and stars, harnessing that in our small, fragile world has really changed everything except the way we think about that, and our governance systems really haven't yet caught up. Just a few of the numbers. Nuclear weapons are pretty hard and awful to think about, but just some of the numbers. It's estimated that all of the explosives that have been used in all wars throughout human history, all the grenades, all the bombs, all the artillery, all the landmines, might now amount to maybe 12 million tonnes of high explosive equivalent. There are single nuclear weapons that have been built, the biggest at 50 million tonnes, which are several times that amount in a single weapon. So these are essentially limitless in scope. Happily, but unfortunately this materially doesn't make us significantly safer, the numbers have reduced by over 80%. So the peak was 70,000 odd in 1986, and it's now down to just under 14,000. Most of those, over 90%, are still in Russian and American hands. About 4,000, just under, are deployed at any one point in time. And about half of those are on high alert, so ready to be launched within a couple of minutes of a decision to do so. So armed, ready to go, on delivery vehicles, fueled, loaded, mostly aimed, ready to go. Their average size is 200,000 tonnes of high explosive equivalent. The Hiroshima bombs, the Nagasaki bomb, were 15 and 20 kilotons, 1,000 tonnes of TNT, respectively. By today's standards, relatively small-sized tactical nuclear weapons. Even though the average size of the weapon in the arsenal has come down as those weapons have become more accurate, it's still over 13 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. And there are still megaton range warheads out there. In fact, if it came to a shooting war between the United States and China, and Australia were caught up in that, principally because of some very high value from a military point of view, military facilities of the United States in Australia, the only land-based missiles that Chinese armed forces have that can reach Australia have nuclear warheads on them. So the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and 3 days later Nagasaki were essentially tactical size weapons. And although it sounds like a very significant reduction, over 80% in weapons numbers, and it is, to get your head around just how gargantuan is the latent destructive capacity in that arsenal, if one Hiroshima-sized bomb were dropped every 2 hours since the end of 1945, you would not have finished yet using up the current arsenal, even with that welcome reduction. It's one of the reasons why that reduction doesn't make us materially safer. WHO, the World Health Organization, the leading technical agency in health in the world, when it examined the impacts of nuclear war on health and health services in a couple of landmark reports in the early 80s, led to the World Health Assembly that represents all nations' ministries of health, concluding unequivocally that nuclear weapons constitute the greatest immediate threat to health and welfare. they also made clear that even a single then average size nuclear weapon detonated on a city would overwhelm the capacity of any single or multiple national response capacities, health and emergency. So from a health point of view, the only logical approach is primary prevention. This simply mustn't be allowed to happen. The most important new science in our understanding of what nuclear weapons do relates to their climate impact. And I think this is a really important conceptual concept for modern citizens to understand, that there are multiple threats to our climate, and just how central is a hospitable and stable climate to human health and well-being, and in fact ecosystem health and well-being. That's jeopardised by global warming. It's also jeopardised by the potential for abrupt global cooling. And nuclear weapons are the most efficient and acute way that that could happen. So how does that work? That's because nuclear weapons are extraordinarily efficient. And in fact, the lower yield weapons that we now have, so tens or hundreds of kilotons rather than megatons, are actually per kiloton about 100 times more effective at immediately killing people and igniting fires as megaton range weapons. They spread the destruction much more efficiently, and that's another reason why reducing the numbers so far hasn't. They have to be reduced a lot more before we're all much safer. It's estimated that even the relatively small bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima released about 1,000 times as much energy in the fires that it started as in the explosive power of the weapon itself. So enormously magnifies its destructive capacity. So if you put one of those large megaton range warheads over, for example, this fair city, then essentially it would ignite to a radius of about 23 kilometres. So Karingbar, Cronulla in the south, Parramatta in the west, almost to Mona Vale in the north, would essentially burn at over 800 degrees Celsius. Most of the oxygen would be consumed, and essentially nothing could survive, even if you were able to survive the initial blast and radiation. About 1,600 square kilometres, everything would burn. The wood, the vegetation, the asphalt, the petroleum products, the plastics, most of the waste, everything combustible would burn. The scenarios that's been most widely studied by different groups of atmospheric scientists, it's really now well-established science, about to be updated in some data that I wish I could show you, but it's going to be published in the next week or two, so I can't yet. But this is a very conservative scenario. So this envisages what might be a realistic place for a regional nuclear war between one of the smaller nuclear powers to start. India and Pakistan have been to war 4 times since their independence. We know that in February, when they was fighting across the border, nuclear weapons use was pretty reliably, reportedly, actively considered on both sides. It's not an unrealistic scenario. This is significantly less than half the current arsenals that those two nations have. They have the 2 most rapidly growing arsenals in the world. But it's estimated that such a war, of course, there would be horrendous local acute casualties, but it's really the climate impacts I want to address. So it's estimated that that would produce about 6 million tonnes of smoke in the upper atmosphere from burning cities. And I remind you that that's less than 0.5% of the number of nuclear weapons in the world. And because these are disproportionately small, Hiroshima-sized, it's less than 0.1% of the explosive yield of the global arsenal. So in nuclear terms, this is a baby war. The smoke would spread from South Asia over most of the inhabited regions of the globe within about 10 to 14 days, and then essentially linger for a very long time. Looked at a different way, this is from Mike Mills' group at the National Centre for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, which is the most recent and sophisticated model. So this is as if you took a cross-section through the atmosphere. The South Pole's here, the equator in the middle, the North Pole up here, and up in the atmosphere is the y-axis. So where our weather happens, where there's clouds and rain, particulate matter gets washed out, is the troposphere down here, a bit higher in the tropics than at the poles. Once things get up into the strata, and particularly the mesosphere, the residence times for particles is very long. They just have to settle by gravity. So look at what happens with this war that's projected to start on the 1st of January. essentially within, again, about a fortnight, most of that smoke, the vast majority of it, is way above the troposphere, up in the stratosphere and beyond, where it, being black, it would heat the upper atmosphere very substantially, over 50 degrees hotter up here, but colder, darker, drier underneath. And that hot smoke in the upper atmosphere would rapidly accelerate destruction of the ozone that protects us from ultraviolet radiation. So different models, different coloured lines, but essentially the smoke settles over a time frame of years. It's darker, colder by about 1.5 degrees, and it's drier. And in Mike's model, these effects haven't returned to baseline as long as the model was run, which was 26 years. So long time. 1.5 degrees might not sound like an awful lot, but that would be much greater in the large land masses where most of the world's grain is grown, 5 to 8 degrees in North America and Eurasia. Growing seasons in most of the food growing regions of the world would be about a month shorter, including in southern Australia. And that ozone depletion that I mentioned would essentially produce UV fluxes that we haven't seen on Earth since basically life came out of the oceans several 100 million years ago. That's not good for people's skin, eyes and immune systems, but it's also very damaging to plant and animal development and growth, both on land and in the water, where UV is already a significant limiting factor for phytoplankton that are the base of the marine food chain. So if you put those effects together, colder, darker, drier, what might that do to human agriculture? Of course, there are other impacts. The UV I've mentioned, the land that would be contaminated by chemical releases from damaged industrial and storage facilities, the radioactivity that would have to take agricultural land out of production, and particularly the disruption to all of the key inputs on which modern agriculture and its trade depends on. Seed, fertiliser, fuel, transport, fuel, machinery, etc. So these are currently being modelled, and there'll be data being released from those studies over the next, starting in the next couple of weeks. But the initial well-validated works looks at just these simple physical parameters, colder, darker, drier. So very much a conservative estimate. And you can see that for the two largest producers in the world, the US and China, for their major grain crops, 15 to 40% declines in the first 5 years, and about half that, 10 to 25% in the second 5 years. So substantial and protracted declines. Currently, there are more than 820 million people that FAO estimates currently today don't have enough to eat. And food insecurity, people who are at least moderately food insecure, several times a year don't know where their next meal is coming from, are growing in number, estimated at about 2 billion by the end of last year. Global grain stocks typically bob around between about 60 and about 110 or 20 days consumption, so a couple of months worth of consumption. And there are several 100 million additional people who have enough to eat today but depend for more than half their energy intake on imported food. That would essentially evaporate if there were a nuclear war and countries were then hoarding and storing food reserves that they were able to muster. So it's pretty easy to see that this small nuclear war in one part of the world would put potentially billions of people at risk of starvation in proportion to their current food insecurity, even on the other side of the planet. Famines of any severity are inevitably followed by epidemics of infectious diseases and often conflict within and sometimes between nations that would likely exacerbate that toll. Let's put this into perspective. This is the concerning global warming trend of the last 150 or so years that is causing so much justified alarm that would be more than rapidly offset by the Indo-Pakistan scenario that I've showed you. And there's nothing specific about this, it's just a plausible example. If just the weapons that the US and Russia have on high alert were used, it would produce about 50 million tonnes of smoke, and that would produce essentially average ice age conditions about 5 degrees colder. If all of the long-range weapons that Russia and the US now have, that they've implemented, all of their current arms control agreements were used, it would get us down to about 10 degrees colder. So much colder than an average ice age. There hasn't been conditions like that on Earth for several million years. And it's pretty hard to see humankind and many other complex species surviving that sort of a severe, abrupt onset global ice age. So a lot of the scientists who've been involved in this work have really characterised that the idea of self-assured destruction, the sort of theoretical underpinning of deterrence theory, that rational actors won't initiate things that invite unacceptable consequences, is really not appropriate. It's really there's no meaningful concept of winners and losers here. These are essentially global suicide bombs that simply can't be used. So how are we tracking? Well, unfortunately, a lot at the moment is not going well. There are no disarmament negotiations underway. The hard-won agreements that have limited development of nuclear weapons and their proliferation, particularly the fruit of the end of the Cold War, the very large reduction in US and Russian arsenals that happened around that time, is being progressively dismantled. The Iran deal recently and the INF Treaty, the signature agreement that ushered in the end of the Cold War, that dismantled verifiably on time by June 1991, 2,692 Russian and American medium-range missiles. All of the nuclear-armed states are investing not just in keeping their weapons, but adding new capacities, more flexible, more accurate, new types of weapons. Nuclear torpedoes, nuclear-powered cruise missiles, hypersonic delivery vehicles, weapons that we haven't seen before. Massive sums, huge opportunity cost that don't speak to a commitment to get rid of these weapons anytime soon. We know that there have been at least 6 occasions when either the US or Russia have initiated launch procedures for nuclear weapons in the mistaken belief that they were under attack. Human and technical error, the combinations of those things that caused those, are not likely to leave us anytime soon. We know that all of the states that have nuclear weapons have planned explicitly for their use on numerous occasions. Daniel Ellsberg's documented at least 25 occasions when the US did so. So this is not just about deterrence. They don't have these weapons actually in order not to use them. And the level of threat escalation in multiple parts of the world from multiple heads of state in recent years has been quite frightening and alarming, and I think is really beyond anything we've seen before. This is a document, a very high-level nuclear strategy document that was publicly released just for a couple of weeks and then withdrawn a couple of months ago, but that really makes it very clear that these are not weapons that we have not to be used. These are weapons to be used for military advantage. Pretty much all of the authoritative assessments about how we're tracking are not favourable. Perhaps the best known is the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists Doomsday Clock, this annual assessment, very serious assessment, 15 Nobel laureates on the board of sponsors, pretty serious group. 2 minutes to midnight was where the hands were moved at the start of last year, and they were kept there this year. That's as far forward as they have ever been. The world's most senior diplomat, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, using pretty blunt language about dangerous times and a new Cold War. The UK House of Lords Committee, in a report just a few months ago, talked very explicitly about the risk of nuclear weapons now being higher than it's been since the end of the Cold War, and essentially us being on the verge of an era when there may be no treaty constraints on nuclear weapons. The US intelligence community, in its annual assessment to Congress earlier this year, made clear that a climate-stressed world is a more conflict-prone world and therefore a more dangerous place to have nuclear weapons. And I think that evidence is already there in the very dramatic upsurge in the last decade or so in the number of internationalised armed conflicts, the number of conflicts that involve at least one state outside the area of actual conflict. I think this reflects growing food and water insecurity, the pressures on population displacement. Each of those poses some, even if small, risk of nuclear escalation. The states involved, the large military powers, disproportionately being nuclear armed. And of course, there's the growing potential of of cyber warfare, which is now really a well-established instrument that a number of states have used, are using on a regular basis. Really quite concerning. And those who've commanded nuclear weapons are pretty clear that nuclear command and control systems, in the US there's greatest transparency, but they also have, their military uses a lot more resources, has a lot more technical backup than most others. So you can be sure that what applies to the US military applies to others, perhaps even more. General James Cartwright making it really clear that nuclear command and control systems are vulnerable, and even the computers of the US National Security Agency being very extensively hacked on at least one occasion. That adds a whole very unpredictable, very difficult to manage, where governments are always playing catch-up aspect to nuclear command and control. And the fissile material, the highly enriched uranium or plutonium that put the nuclear in nuclear weapons, you need essentially a few kilogram quantities for a weapon, depending on its size and sophistication. And the world essentially is awash with these materials, 1,340 tonnes of highly enriched uranium and more than 500 tonnes of separated plutonium, and a lot more in spent nuclear fuel. If you use these numbers applied to these, you can see that there's enough fissile material already in civilian and military stocks globally to reconstitute the global nuclear arsenal many times over. So keeping this stuff out of weapons, ceasing its production, keeping it really secure and eliminating it where possible is absolutely crucial to achieving and sustaining a world free of nuclear weapons. And it makes it clear that a rules-based order that works, that keeps this stuff out of weapons, is really an absolutely crucial requirement. So, disarmament obligations, I think it's worth reminding ourselves just how deep and long these run. The very first resolution of the General Assembly in 1946 that came together in the aftermath of the worst war in history, its very first resolution called for the elimination of atomic weapons, January 1946. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, which all but 4 nations have joined, many nations regard as the sort of key part of international law in this space, embodies a binding legal obligation on all states, not just those that have nuclear weapons, to negotiate in good faith to disarm. And the world's highest legal authority, the International Court of Justice, has unanimously said, their opinions are not often unanimous, but this one was, that this obligation is not just to negotiate, but actually to finish the job, to bring the negotiations to a conclusion. We have made really significant progress that we should take heart from in controlling the other major types of indiscriminate and inhumane weapons: biological and chemical weapons, landmines, cluster munitions. In each case, the evidence that these are unacceptable however they're used, codifying their rejection in a treaty that has provided the same standard for all nations, has been crucial to the progress, to motivating and being the basis for the efforts to control the weapons. All of these are not yet finished, but for all of them, they're now much less often used and produced and deployed and traded and justified than before those treaties existed. And I think it's worth reflecting that in terms of the lessons of experiences, there hasn't been an indiscriminate weapon that we've made significant progress on without there being a prohibition treaty. It codifies that these are beyond the pale, no state should have them. But until 2017, this approach had not been applied to nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons were left out of the Geneva Conventions. The Red Cross was under huge pressure in the late 50s when they were negotiated by the nuclear-armed states. They have not been covered by much in the way of international law, and specifically international humanitarian law before. And these norms matter. Angela Kane, when she was the UN's most senior disarmament representative, highlighted the fact that no nation boasts about its capacity to threaten biological or chemical weapons, essentially because of the power of the norm that has now grown around those weapons. So how did we get to this treaty, and what role did civil society play, and how did some of this work? Let me just give you a bit of a snapshot to get to the treaty and how we can use it. I want to pay tribute to Ron McCoy, whose inspiration ICAN was, wonderful Malaysian obstetrician. And he was shamelessly plagiarising essentially the good lessons of the international campaign to ban landmines. Don't set up a new organisation. Build a campaign coalition that makes it easy and encourages existing organisations to join and work together with a very clear goal, a treaty to ban and provide for the elimination of the worst weapons of all, based not on the politics and the security arguments, but their unacceptable humanitarian consequences, the evidence of what they actually do. And this was clearly the right idea at the right time. It was founded in Melbourne and really grew more than any of us could have expected. But we were also fortunate in a sense in terms of the political environment that we were able to take advantage of. And I just want to acknowledge that philanthropy and altruism can take many forms, but often the people that funding it is not, those people aren't celebrated, in my view, often enough. And the remarkable Mark Whitten and Eve Cantor and the extended family of Eve, who have been absolutely crucial to ICAN's success in investing in this idea and sticking with us, has enabled an enormous amount, and it was really wonderful to see them recognised by Philanthropy Australia earlier this year. But the political environment at that time there was a moment. We had for the first time a presidential candidate and then president in the United States who talked repeatedly about the abolition of nuclear weapons as a central foreign policy goal. Long on rhetoric, short on delivery, but it changed the game. And that helped to encourage the world's largest humanitarian organisation, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, to really get serious about this as unfinished humanitarian business, getting rid of the world's worst weapons. In 2010, President Kellenberger really put that on the line. That led to the first statement ever in a non-proliferation treaty, consensus statement expressing deep concern about the catastrophic consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. And on the back of that, 3 states, Norway, Mexico and then Austria, in fairly rapid succession, organised in 2013 and 14, what were the first ever, amazing, it took more than 70 years for states to actually sit together for the first time to discuss the consequences of these weapons. And the conclusions, 158 governments in Vienna, were really clear. Any use of nuclear weapons would be an unmitigated catastrophe for which no effective response is possible. The risks have been underestimated and are growing, and that there is this legal anomaly that sees the last and worst weapons of mass destruction as the only major kind of indiscriminate weapon not to be outlawed by international treaty. That led to the Austrian government making a commitment that it invited other governments to join in working to fill that legal gap, and pretty quickly about 2/3 of the world's governments did. Of course, the dilemma is that states that don't own the weapons unfortunately can't get rid of them, unfortunately. So what can they do? Well, the lessons of cluster munitions and landmines in particular is that they can ban them. If they used the right forum, that couldn't be blocked. And building coalitions is, of course, crucial in any kind of advocacy work, any kind of work at all, really, almost. But I really want to flag that one of the coalitions I'm particularly pleased and proud about was essentially we were able to bring together all of the key international health federations, doctors, nurses, public health professionals, to work with international physicians for the prevention of nuclear war in testimony, submissions, commentary, working papers, oral presentations to all of the UN processes in 2014, 15 and 16, with united voice to say you need to get rid of these things as a planetary health imperative. And that was really influential. And some of the language of those submissions is in this treaty. So the UN General Assembly mandated negotiations at the end of 2016 in a vote of over 3-1. Pretty tall order though. You've only got 8 months and you've only got 4 weeks of negotiations to negotiate a new treaty to ban nuclear weapons. If you haven't done the job by the 7th of July, the mandate expired and all bets are off, go home, turn into pumpkins, start again. So there was a lot of pressure on that, extraordinarily well presided over by this remarkable diplomat, Ambassador Elaine White Gomez from Costa Rica, an absolutely extraordinary leader. Civil society had amazing access to this in the General Assembly. And what was particularly powerful, and I'm also particularly proud of about the way that ICAN worked, was combining the sort of facts and data that's in my shop that I can talk to you about, with the survivors, the lived stories, the testimony, the powerful, courageous, painful and difficult stories of people for whom nuclear weapons are not an abstract geopolitical chess game, but a lived daily reality of suffering and loss and ill health and displacement across generations. Auntie Sue Coleman Hasseldine from South Australia and Karina Lester, Yummy Lester, her father may be better known to you, who was one of the key people that got the Royal Commission into British nuclear tests in Australia going, were absolutely crucial. They cut through like nothing else I've ever seen, reminding the diplomats constantly of why their work mattered and motivating them. Because they were there, this is the first disarmament treaty ever to acknowledge the disproportionate impacts of nuclear weapons on Indigenous people. So when it came to the vote, because the 9 nuclear-armed states and the 30-odd states that claim protection from nuclear weapons stayed away, the rest of the world essentially gets this. So the vote was pretty overwhelming, 122 to 1. It was an absolutely extraordinary moment where the normal form and reserved formality of just erupted in joy and tears and embraces. This is Elaine with Setsuko Thurlow, the Hiroshima survivor, who has been so crucial to ICAN and co-accepted our Nobel Peace Prize. And everybody involved in this said this wouldn't have happened without civil society backing, covering for, encouraging, supporting, shaming, whatever it needed, help working with governments to make this happen. So nuclear weapons are now on the way to becoming prohibited in international law, the same as those other weapons, and we're doing reasonably well. This treaty will enter into force when 50 states have ratified. It takes a while for these things to get through parliaments and bureaucracies and governments. 79 signatures and 32 ratifications as of today, 12 just in the last week. Just fantastic. So we're going places. I'm really hopeful that this treaty will enter into force by the end of next year. As Elaine said, this is really a statement of hope and possibility, and a really important one in a pretty dark time. But in a sense, it's the easy part, because that was the states that get it, that wanted to act. How do we use this treaty? Well, leadership is a crucial thing, and we are not seeing it from the states that have the weapons. But I remind you that it's a renewable commodity and that nobody has a monopoly on this, and that we can all exercise our leadership. This treaty matters because it completes the prohibition of indiscriminate weapons. It will help drive divestment, and it will stigmatise the weapons. One of the things that gives me the most courage and hope about this is the extent to which the nuclear-armed states hate this treaty. This is not some fine piece of UN verbiage that they can happily ignore because it really just will wash over. This makes a difference. And in their private statements, we were leaked the US instruction to its NATO allies as to why they had to vote against the negotiating mandate. And it was completely different from the public justifications about why this treaty was a bad idea. Divisive, unhelpful, ineffective, all sorts of things. Conflict with the NPT, none of that. This would delegitimise nuclear deterrence. It would interfere with NATO nuclear war planning. Yep. It would potentially have effects even before it entered into force, even on states that didn't join it. It was the recognition that this treaty would work as intended. That gives me enormous courage. I get courage from the fact that when I go to UN meetings, I hear US diplomats boast their virtual compliance with the landmines ban. They opposed those negotiations. They haven't signed that treaty, but the norm is powerful enough that they now boast at the UN that they're in compliance with that treaty. these treaties matter, and we have to work to use them to help them matter more. The national legislation that will enact countries' obligations under this treaty might include criminal sanctions that might also be quite helpful. Most importantly, as well as a comprehensive prohibition on nuclear weapons, it provides a framework, and it's the only agreed international framework at present for countries to actually fulfil their obligation, whether they have nuclear weapons or not, to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons. So it really does light a path forward, and it strengthens international law, and it really provides a moment of truth. If you're serious about disarmament, you will sign this treaty, and if you don't, then I think you've got some pretty serious questions to answer. There is some really valuable support, but we need a lot more leadership from different social sectors. The Red Cross movement's been really strong about this. Some faith leaders have stepped up in very welcome ways. Pope Francis, for example, being really clear about the Catholic position that possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. Most health bodies are on board, the World Medical Association calling on all governments to join the treaty. When national governments won't act, every level of government, regional, city, state, has as its fundamental core the obligation to protect its citizens, has a legitimate interest in this issue. So cities calling on their national governments to join the treaty and promoting awareness of the treaty and their actions amongst their citizens there's so far 22 Australian cities that have done so, plenty more to go, many around the world. And you know, these are important. In Japan, where the government, like ours, is opposed to the treaty, Hiroshima having the moral authority to call on the Japanese government to join is an important statement. And this is the mural that Darebin City did in Melbourne, honours Yami Lester and ICANN's Nobel Peace Prize and the Lester family. State legislatures in the US calling for the federal government to join. And already before the treaty even enters into force, we see money starting to move. The world's largest sovereign wealth fund, the Norwegian pension fund, Europe's largest pension fund. Sorry, this is the largest sovereign wealth fund. And a couple of big banks, Deutsche Bank, largest Belgian bank, KBC, and a few others have, on the back of these weapons now being on the way to becoming illegal under international law, have said on humanitarian grounds we're out of investing in companies that profit from making these. And that's something I think that provides enormous possibility for civil society action as people have become familiar with on the climate front. There are 4 big Australian financial institutions that between them have $6.5 billion invested in companies that make nuclear weapons. They need to hear from their account and shareholders. My university, I'm not proud to say, has research collaborations with the world's largest weapons manufacturer seriously involved in nuclear weapons, Lockheed Martin. This is not something that I want my university. I think this is an unethical collaboration, and I know there's been similar concerns about the University of Sydney, and I think this is also an important way for us to clean up our own shop. And this has ripple effects, this treaty. The UN Human Rights Commission recently issued a general comment, so that's the most authoritative guidance on interpretation of international human rights law. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is a pretty major human rights instrument. They said, essentially, that nuclear weapons are incompatible with respect for the right to life under this covenant, really clearly making this a human rights issue. Australia, unfortunately, has been on the wrong side of history on this one, and was one of the reasons why the term weasel became widespread in the corridors of Geneva and New York in recent years. And it's essentially because of our conflicted position. It's hard to be serious about disarming nuclear weapons when we claim that they're central to our security. And it's at complete odds with the fact that we've signed up to, and in fact in some cases been a leader on, all of the other conventions that prohibit indiscriminate and inhumane weapons. For all of the reasons why a rules-based cooperative order is required to deal with complex challenges, these are reasons why Australia needs to join this treaty. ICANN's just produced a major report. I've got a couple of paper copies, but freely available online, that makes, I think, a pretty cogent case as to why Australia needs to join this treaty. And important to recognise that this is entirely compatible with a military alliance with the United States, contrary to some prominent commentators' views. More than half of the US's major non-NATO allies support this treaty. 3 have signed, 2 have ratified. For none of them has there been any disruption to their military cooperation with the US because it doesn't involve nuclear weapons. I've now had the privilege of being associated with 2 Nobel Peace Prizes, and they're remarkably similar in their citations, and they also really help to encourage, I think, all of us about the power of civil society, what a few determined people can do. That's what changes things. In IPPNW's case, it was for spreading authoritative information about the real consequences of atomic warfare in a way that had political traction, in this case helping to end the Cold War. In ICAN's case, it was remarkably similar. Similar first part of the citation, drawing attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons in a way that had political traction in negotiating, being a key partner for governments in negotiating a new international treaty. It's the first Nobel Peace Prize born in Australia. It's a really proud thing to share, and I'm delighted to share it with you. And I think crucially for all of us, it speaks to the power of what a few people with a vision and a plan working together can achieve. So I think for all of the reasons why effective altruism is smart and clever about guiding us about how to make a difference, for me, they're all reasons as to why I'm going to keep working on this as long as I possibly can. Our existential dilemma for me is really summed up in this question. Will it be the end of nuclear weapons or the end of us? It's going to be one of those 2 things. Time is not on our side, but we can do this and we all have a job to do. Thanks very much.
So, first of all, a few people are wondering what exactly it means if the 2017 treaty does come into force. So if the states do ratify, what are the implications of that?
Technically, international treaties are only binding on the states that join them. So when countries ratify a treaty, they're then in a position they've said, we're now legally bound by this treaty, which means that all of their domestic legislation and ducks need to be in a row to be in compliance with the treaty. So that will mean that their military activities, their security forces, will not in any way support the threat or possible use of nuclear weapons. Hopefully for many of them it will involve divestment, particularly of public funds, but potentially also private divestment from companies that profit from nuclear weapons. And I think it's very likely to include criminal sanctions against anybody subject to their jurisdiction from being involved in any activities related to nuclear weapons. Some of the treaty obligations are also so-called positive obligations, and there are obligations there to, like the landmines and cluster munitions treaties, the so-called humanitarian disarmament treaties, there are obligations for assistance to victims of nuclear use and testing and for remediation of environments contaminated by nuclear use and testing. It's unclear what form that will take, but I think that's a really important way of making sure that that legacy of injustice and contamination doesn't get swept under the carpet. There's also an obligation in the treaty to promote its universalisation. So they should make it an active part of their bilateral, regional and international diplomacy to promote the treaty. And once the treaty enters into force, then within the first year and then on a regular basis subsequently, there will be meetings of states parties, the first of which we already know will be in Vienna, where states will come together, Red Cross, civil society partners like ICAN, and develop plans to promote and implement the treaty more effectively.
Okay, thank you. I guess piggybacking off that question, one of the criticisms of, our global approach to things like the Biological Weapons Convention, for example, isn't that even though there's a convention in place, there isn't the resources or people that are on the job to ensure enforcement, or ensuring enforcement of the convention is difficult. If the treaty was to come into place, what kind of enforcement, mechanisms would there be to ensure that states are meeting their obligations?
Yes, for many of the states that don't have nuclear weapons, their obligations are largely already covered by their safeguards agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency or by their participation in nuclear weapons-free zones. But verification is a huge issue. One of the things that we were really hoping for was a substantial secretariat for the treaty. It was negotiated within and is a UN treaty, so it's the day job of the Secretary-General and the Officers of Disarmament and Legal Affairs to promote the treaty. We pushed quite hard during the negotiations to try and get a secretariat. One of the reasons why the Chemical Weapons Convention is so effective, and I think the most effectively implemented of the weapons prohibition treaties, is that it has, a strong cadre of 400 or 500, lawyers, specialists, people whose day job it is in The Hague, in the OPCW, to work to promote the implementation of the treaty and investigate alleged violations. The argument of the states leading the negotiations was that could be added later, and there was also a significant resource factor. I mean, disproportionately, the states that support the treaty are not the largest economies and the wealthiest countries. So supporting a secretariat has significant financial implications and was thought to be able to be added later. In the framework for the safeguards provisions that countries have to have under the treaty, they're a bit stronger, but they're essentially covered by the International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards that are required under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. For the disarmament part, when that happens, the framework that's in this treaty is not totally specific. So there's a lot of detail there that wasn't possible to negotiate and would have been beyond the mandate. But it outlines a really clear process. So countries can either destroy their nuclear weapons and then join the treaty, or join the treaty and then destroy their nuclear weapons. Either way, they're going to be subject to submitting a plan that's time-bound and verified, that's agreed by states parties and that's subject to verification by an international agency. And it's not clear yet who that will be. Many of us think that probably needs to be a new agency. So the framework is robust in the sense that it's a clear pathway, but a lot of the detailed building blocks are not yet in place. Okay. But verification is crucial. But I should just add, we know how to do this. The START Treaty, the INF Treaty, and a number of other nuclear treaties have reduced nuclear weapon numbers, eliminated whole class of them in the case of the INF Treaty in a verified way. So we know how to do this.
Just jumping onto that, do you foresee getting the required resources to implement this properly being a challenge? And do you think that the way to approach that would be different to the current approach of trying to get the treaty in place?
I think one step at a time, but the first priority is really to get the treaty into force, to get as many signatures and ratifications as possible, to not just get it into force, but also give it moral and political weight. The more countries that join, the better, the more. And obviously that really needs civil society pushing governments. Having strong domestic implementing regimes to implement their commitments under the treaty will also be crucial. So working with those governments to make sure that their domestic legal context is strong is important. Using the treaty to maximum effect to progress the elimination of nuclear weapons, I think will be need to look different in different places. Will be quite different in the nuclear armed states, the sort of umbrella states, and potentially others. But there's some really common threads. The importance of diverse civil society voices raising this, the importance of stigmatising the weapons through divestment work will carry across all of them, and looking for political opportunities and working not just with current incumbent governments but potential future governments. For us in Australia, getting the Labor Party at its national conference in December to make an explicit commitment that Labor in government will sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, having the alternative government of the country commit to that was a really important step for us. It clearly needs to be built much more widely across party, and it's been hard to make much traction in the coalition, frankly, to date. but this needs to be a humanitarian issue that's above party politics. And support for all of the other treaties has been, in the end, bilateral.
Okay. I'll just have two more questions. So a few people had asked about the implications of nuclear power and what that might have for the risk of nuclear war, and I guess your stance on that, given that nuclear power, some people think it's important for mitigating some climate change risks as well.
International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War took the position very clearly back in 1998 that if you just look at the proliferation risks, nuclear power was really way too dangerous to be a sustainable or safe solution. ICAN doesn't specifically campaign on this issue. It's pretty much focused on weapons, but ICAN in Australia has also taken a pretty clear position that from a proliferation point of view, this is a real problem. You can't separate the capacity to produce enriched uranium to run reactors or the capacity to have reactors and therefore have spent fuel come out of them which contains plutonium. You can't separate that from the ability to produce fissile materials that can be used in weapons. And many, in fact all of the states around the world that have nuclear weapons have used several nuclear programs, research and power to either develop weapons in the first place or then to augment their nuclear weapons programs. Nuclear power itself has risks of really catastrophic accidents. I think the weaponisation of nuclear facilities for me is a major concern from a health point of view. There is a vast amount of long-lived radioisotopes in spent fuel, and particularly in the spent fuel ponds that accompany most nuclear power reactors that don't have any of the carefully engineered layers of containment. They're just basically swimming pools in a shed, and they have very large amounts of long-lived radioactivity. As Fukushima showed us, you wouldn't need to attack that with a military scale attack. Simple disruption of the power and the cooling water to the reactor or the spent fuel ponds or both could create not a nuclear explosion but a radiological disaster that could actually be worse than a nuclear explosion. So I think from multiple points of view, we need win-win solutions to the existential twin threats of climate disruption and nuclear war. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists said that increasing the risk of nuclear war is a bad trade for controlling climate change.
I think, you said in your presentation that by effective altruism lights, the work that you're doing is very important, and I would agree with that. And I think we're all probably very happy with your decision to continue doing this work. So please join me in thanking Professor Ruff for his presentation.